Gentryville is a small town in southwest Indiana. The community nestled in the Ohio River Valley, a few miles north of the river's water and downstream from Louisville, Kentucky, 30 minutes from Evansville, Indiana. The town was founded by James Gentry in the early 1800s. The community has never been larger than a few hundred people, and today the population is a mere 250. So how is it that I can claim this place, its founder, and another insignificant citizen in 1828 would change the world, or at least certainly America, forever? James Gentry was a wealthy landowner and had established a good-sized farm on nearly 5,000 acres of land in what is today Spencer County. Yearly, Mr. Gentry would load his harvest of various products aboard a flatboat and send it to market in the lower Mississippi River Valley, by way of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. In those days, a much larger population of people could be found in the plantation region and in the markets down in New Orleans. Mr. Gentry's son, who had reached his teenage years, would serve as captain of the flatboat soon to make its way downriver, but he needed someone to accompany his son on the trip. James knew a young farmhand and clerk at a local general store who he thought was a very trustworthy and intelligent man. James, in the late summer of 1828, would ask this young man to make the trip downriver to New Orleans for a salary of $8 a month. The young man, now 18 or 19, was very excited about the chance at an adventure like this, the likes of which he'd only read about in books. His entire life up to this point had been on the frontier, working the land and clearing forest. This would be a chance of a lifetime, and he was not going to pass it up. With the boat loaded at dock in Tell City, the 3-month adventure was about to begin for the two young Indiana frontiersmen. James Gentry had built a 60-foot flatboat and packed it full of goods to be sold at market along the lower Mississippi. Even the boat, once it reached New Orleans, would be torn apart by the two men and sold for lumber to build a house in the city. Indiana lumber was perfect building material and very much sought after. Even the nails used to hold the boat together would be salvaged and sold. River travel could be very dangerous and would take about 30 days to reach New Orleans, floating with the current, if all went well. Another 2 months would be needed to make the trip overland back home to Indiana. One of the first things that would some years later be noted by these two men was a place along the Ohio River on the Illinois side. They came upon a large cave naturally carved into the bedrock cliffs that line the riverbanks. Today we know this area as Cave in Rock, Illinois, but in that day the sign hanging from the entrance and viewable to boat people traveling the river read Wilson's Liquor Vault and House of Entertainment. The two now young men and river explorers were surely at least curious about what was inside, but for whatever reason they did not stop nor venture inside. In the days and weeks after they would float on past, it would be discovered that the Wilson gang, who controlled the cave, would lure travelers inside, rob and even sometimes kill them, and themselves sell the boat and the goods aboard. 60 bodies would be discovered inside that cave in the rock. This trip, however, would continue down the Ohio River towards Cairo, Illinois, where the waters of the Ohio would flow into one of the largest and longest rivers in the world, the great Mississippi River. A second notable event took place while in the Mississippi River Delta. An attack was launched on the boat near Madame Duchesne's plantation by 7 or 8 rogue slaves attempting to steal items or possibly even take control of the entire boat. The two young men were able to fight off the slaves and escape downriver with the boat and the goods intact. The younger Gentry, serving as captain of the boat, was amazed as he watched his oarsman, a very tall and awkward fellow, fight off most of the slaves single-handed, while only sustaining a cut above his eye. The injury, while minor, would scar him for the rest of his life, but what a story he would have to forever tell. Back in Indiana, he was very popular around the general store, where he served as a clerk, because of his interesting stories he told. Up until now, stories mostly read about in books. Finally, the two backwoods frontiersmen would successfully reach New Orleans. And what a sight it must have been. New Orleans at that time very different than the woodlands of southwest Indiana. They would find a very rowdy city, and at that time in history, debauchery would flow out of the storefronts and into the streets. Soon the two would stumble onto a sight that Captain Gentry would describe as visibly shaking his friend. Gentry said you could see the disappointment on the young man's face, and Gentry knew what they had witnessed was making his friend physically and emotionally upset. You see, what they had witnessed on the streets of New Orleans were slaves being traded like animals, black men being beaten, and families being torn apart before their very eyes. The shaken young man would say to his captain that if I ever get a chance to hit this thing, slavery, he would hit it hard. The oarsman James Gentry had hired for this trip to New Orleans was none other than a young 19-year-old Abraham Lincoln, who some 30 years later would become President of the United States. And while you may have never heard this story, you already know the rest.